This podcast is brought to you by Progressive. Most of you aren't just listening right now. You're driving, cleaning, even exercising. But what if you could be saving money by switching to Progressive? Drivers who save by switching save nearly $750 on average, and auto customers qualify for an average of 7 discounts. Multitask right now. Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $744 by new customers surveyed who save with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary. Discounts not available in all states and situations.
Hello! I'm so excited. Welcome to Money Talks from Slate Money, live from Cavallo Point, Sausalito. I am Felix Salmon of Axios, and this is a podcast where I talk to awesome, brilliant, interesting, fabulous people. And so we looked around the illustrious list of awesome, brilliant, fabulous people, and we discovered that the most awesome and the most brilliant and the most fabulous person is Jerusalem Demsas.
Hello.
Jerusalem, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
And introduce yourself. Who are you?
Well, I have the official title of being the best person in Sausalito, apparently. But other than that, I am a staff writer at The Atlantic, where I write about housing and infrastructure and local democracy, and I talk to people like you.
We are here at the Hewlett Foundation's New Common Sense Conference, which is all about economics and post-neoliberal economic paradigms and policy wonkery and that kind of thing. And I thought that for a change of pace, we would talk about something a little bit more micro, which is housing, partly because it's counter-programming from the economic fare of the rest of the conference, but also because we are in the heart of housing politics right here. There is nowhere on the planet that exemplifies the NIMBY versus YIMBY fight more than Northern California. And we are in a massive, wide open space in this hotel, which is spread across acres and has about 8 rooms in it, in a city with some of the highest housing costs in the world, which is desperate for density. And you are going to tell me, I'm sure, that like where we are right now is exemplifies that's everything that's wrong with Bay Area housing. Am I right?
I don't know. It's funny because we were just looking outside and you can see this view of the Golden Gate Bridge, and it's like quite close actually to downtown San Francisco. And it's funny when people think about the NIMBY-YIMBY debates, they're mostly talking about one side just thinks everywhere should just be developed, and the other side is like opposed to all sorts of development. In many ways, it's funny like the way that in my mind you end up preserving like beautiful spots like this is you actually figure out where you're going to develop enough. Otherwise, development pressures come to some of the most beautiful spots in the world. I think we're on, as you told me earlier, we're on public land here. So we definitely don't want to be encroaching there if that's the situation.
So the idea is that you pick the beautiful spots to keep beautiful and undeveloped. And the way you get to do that is by having high density, transit rich, walkable neighborhoods everywhere else.
Well, I wouldn't say you pick the beautiful spots and keep them undeveloped, but you should pick spots that you think are important for conservation purposes, right? And like in many ways, people who think of themselves as conservationists are often just opposed to development regardless because they view that as sort of oppositional like concerns. But really what ends up happening is when we think about sprawl, where the development pressure is headed towards wetlands or is headed towards places where you want to maintain public access to beaches. I mean, that's in places that otherwise don't have to be developed if we make sure to build up in really productive areas like downtown SF or downtown Boston or downtown DC or LA, where it's already developed. It's just not developed intensely enough.
San Francisco is famously, the vast majority of it is incredibly low rise. It's zoned for like no one. And there's a huge amount of demand from people who would love to live there and can't because there's just not enough housing to go around. What is the main reason why it doesn't get upzoned? Why there isn't just 5 times more housing in San Francisco than we have?
Yes, so there's tons of development pressure, and the reason we know that, right, is because prices for homes here are just astronomical. I mean, you'll talk about a home that's maybe like 1,400 square feet, and it's selling for $1 million prices, and that's not natural. That happens because you're not responding to the demand that exists. And so the big reason for San Francisco in particular is that there are a lot of procedures in place that make it really easy for anyone to block a new development to happen. So it's very easy in San Francisco, much more so than it's a problem across the US, but it's particularly bad in San Francisco, where it's really easy for an individual to raise a concern to, their local elected official, and they can get a hearing put in place to consider whether or not a new housing unit can be developed, and there's a real bias against certain kinds of housing. We've developed in the United States this sense that there's like one good type of house and it's a single family home. It has space around it. In places like San Francisco, there's like a few more types. They're like these kind of beautiful, large row houses that maybe are considered part of the good life, what we kind of want to develop. And then we've really categorized a lot of other housing as kind of inherently bad or unsightly. We think about apartment buildings. I mean, it's literally codified into some of our legal language that these are blights, that these are nuisances. And what's really important is not just when someone has some sort of NIMBY, not in my backyard complaint, but what the default context looks like, right? Because here in San Francisco, the default is that it's not easy. You can buy right, which means like as long as you follow all the rules, you can just develop a property. Very few kinds of homes. And in most of the country, buy right development is only for a certain kind of single family home with a certain amount of land around it. And that just naturally drives up the price.
These days, well, probably for all time, but especially right now, very few people think of themselves as NIMBYs. People, I'm sure you report on this all the time. And I'm sure most of the NIMBYs you talk to get quite offended if they're accused of being NIMBYs. So to try and put yourself in their shoes for a minute, like how did they think of themselves?
Oh, I mean, I think I understand NIMBYs really well because I think in many ways, I have like NIMBY tendencies, which is, I think, very normal. I think most people do. But not in my backyard used to mean something really specific. It meant that you were like in favor of something in the abstract, right? But like you oppose it in your backyard. So it could mean something like you kind of want there to be like a water or sewage treatment plant somewhere in your city because you want there to be toilet services where you live, but you don't want it like right behind you. But then it's sorts of this kind of gets expanded to sort of mean someone who opposes development for any reason we consider quote unquote bad. So in many ways, when I think about NIMBYs, I mean, I think it's a very natural thing to be afraid of change. When I go back to the places where I grew up in suburban Maryland, and it looks very different when I go back now. Like my sister and I would drive when we were home for the holidays, we would drive around and there's a lot more development. It's changed significantly. We felt nostalgic for it. I could imagine that if we'd been living there this whole time, we would have been like, wait, that's like the field that we used to like walk our dog in. And now we can no longer do that because someone has bought that area and now there's, apartment buildings going up. Or parking has changed. I think parking is really big for people. They feel really scared of losing scarce free resource that is really easy, especially the suburbs. The big promise is that you get to live in this nice house, you get to have a cool car, and you get to just drive around, and it's frictionless. It's like a frictionless life that you can sort of count on in these places. You're retreating from the costs that often exist in cities and urban cores, but still getting to benefit from the job market by remaining there. And so I think it's very reasonable to understand why any individual person is a NIMBY. The question is, what do you do when those kinds of feelings come into contact with another major concern, which most people have, which is that the housing market doesn't really work for a lot of people. It doesn't work for young people who want to live near good jobs and have reasonable rent. It doesn't work for people who want to buy a house for the first time. It doesn't even work for older Americans who, while they're sitting on this maybe $1 million asset, they feel trapped in that asset. They feel like they can't downsize. AARP has actually become a huge player in the YIMBY battles because they're realizing they have tons of people in their constituency that are trapped on the first floor of their homes because they're no longer mobile enough to go to the second floor. And depending on the layout, that means maybe you don't have access to your bathroom, maybe you don't have access to your closet, and they can't downsize and remain in their own community because there's not housing available built for anyone who needs a condo or a smaller home or something where you can have access to an elevator. And so in many ways, people are having these NIMBY tendencies and they will express them when they're asked whether they want new development. But then they're also really upset at the outcome that all of these NIMBY tendencies have added up to create.
When it comes to your finances, go for the credit card that's always there for you. With 24/7 US-based live customer service from Discover, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We're talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
This episode is brought to you by ZBiotics. Let's face it, after a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. You have to make a choice. You can either have a great night or a great next day. ZBiotics is a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. ZBiotics produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night, drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. Go to zbiotics.com/slate to get 15% off your first order when you use SLATE at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with 100% money-back guarantee, so if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/slate and use the code SLATE at checkout for 15% off.
The one NIMBY motivation that you didn't mention is just pure greedy economics. They intuitively understand the rules of supply and demand, and that if the supply of housing in any given neighborhood goes up, then that is going to have downward pressure on the value of their particular house. And the more scarce that housing is, the more valuable it is. And if you own your own house, you have a vested interest in that house being as valuable as possible. So we were talking earlier about, isn't it nice when you actually do empirical economics rather than just doing this kind of stuff in theory? How does that play out empirically in practice? Is it the case that when you start allowing, ADUs or whatever they're called, when you start allowing more different types of condos, when you start allowing more building in a neighborhood, does that bring down the value of the existing housing stock?
So I used to believe that a lot of NIMBYism was basically just about property value protection, that people were, and I thought this was I rated this extremely highly. I'm like, people just really don't want to see their property values go down. They're terrified to see an apartment building come up, and then all of a sudden, if they want to sell their house, no one's going to want to buy it because they're going to be disgusted, I guess, at all the people living in apartments. I have begun to really reduce my belief in how strongly this motivates people for a couple of reasons. One, there are a lot of times in which upzoning raises property values, right? You can imagine, for instance, you live in San Francisco and it becomes possible for your single family home to now be developed into an apartment building. A developer will now pay you so much more money to develop your home because they know that they can extract many more rents than just from a single family home. They can extract it from 20, 30, 40 families. So there should be, if everyone's thinking very strategically and logically about the financial possibility of what their house can become, that there should be evidence that you would find people in America trying to get their block just upzoned, strategically when they're going to leave or whatever. You don't see this happening. I have not found a single piece of evidence, and I talked to someone in London who was trying to get this done, this sort of block level voting on housing reform. And I asked him, I was just like, why don't we see anyone trying to do this organically? I don't think I got a very good answer there. And the second reason is that when I talk to a lot of people who are involved in housing fights, I've been in places pretty diverse locations, anywhere from Denver to Salt Lake City to places in California, Virginia, Florida. And I go to these places and people use the word property value to mean something much more than just what I think the literal cost or they can sell their home for a new buyer to. They're not just thinking about what their Zestimate is going to do. They're thinking the way that I value my immediate vicinity is more than just that cost, it's also, do I feel like there's enough green space here? Do I feel like it's quiet? Do I like the kinds of people who are walking around? Do I like the kinds of people who are going to school with my kids? Or do I like what's happening? Just all these sorts of things that add up to mean the value. And I think that it's why it's really important to think about how many ways we've socially constructed what it means to have like a negative influence on your own community, and how many of these things we can change, because Americans will constantly go to other countries and they'll just walk around. They're like, wow, like I'm having such a great time in Berlin. I'm like, I just love Paris and London's so wonderful. And these are wealthy people in these cities who are living in multifamily housing. And Americans will go to these places and often not realize how much their own conception of what a good neighborhood looks like is completely different than often how they don't even experience it when they're abroad.
It's a status quo bias more than anything else. And the United States has become much less mobile over the years. I think there was, I don't know quite what the pandemic did. There was obviously a big uptick in mobility during the pandemic. But I think the long-term secular trend is that people are staying for longer in neighborhoods. And once you put down roots somewhere, you've chosen somewhere, you kind of don't want it to change. And one of the really fascinating things I see in the status quo bias is that it works both ways. There is both what you were talking about in terms of the fear that increased density will mean poorer people, will mean renters, will mean, the kind of people who we haven't normally had in this neighborhood. But it is also the case in places like New York, where I live, that new construction is feared because it will bring in the yuppies, it'll bring in the rich, it'll cause gentrification, and it'll cause like all of the millionaires to start buying $1 million condos, and we don't want them either.
Yeah, can you imagine rich people in New York? Yes, no, this is something that people are really concerned about, and I don't think it's like fake or anything like that. I think there are a couple of things. One is that there is a lot of change that happens in a way that feels untrackable to people. It feels like they don't understand how it's happened, but all of a sudden it seems like the composition of this neighborhood has changed, or like some of the places you used to go to, they don't exist, and in their place, it's like a Blue Bottle or a Blank Street or not Foxtrot, I guess, anymore. And that sort of thing, it becomes very difficult to track because, of course, there's like a natural churn of businesses regularly. So it's like very difficult to track for a regular person, like why something is happening, why your corner store no longer looks like that or anything like that. So I don't think it's people being like dumb or irrational. But I think the second thing is just that while it is the case that often you do see nice new apartment buildings and condos go up right as you see rich people move in, I think people are regularly getting the causality backwards here. New York City is one of the best places you can go to get a good job if you are a young urban professional. San Francisco, Los Angeles, these like major cities are where people go after they go to college. And the question when they move there is, are there places available for them to live, or are they going to bid up the price of your housing? And, my sister and her partner lived in Brooklyn for a decade. My sister moved there when she was, 18 years old. And they lived and they made their good money. They're yuppies. My sister went to Barnard and then graduated Barnard and then went over to Brooklyn to live. And I remember going to their apartment, I'm like, this is not up to code. Like, these stairs are not up to code. The fire alarm doesn't work. You've had 2 carbon monoxide potential leaks. It's just insane. And they're like living in Brooklyn. They're paying really high rent. All this was happening. And to me, I watched that. And then during the pandemic, there were all these viral videos of like yuppies like lining up for blocks for like one apartment in New York City, or like in DC where I live. I talked to a realtor who said that she had to hire a bouncer at open houses in order to like maintain order as people were trying to like line up to see the home. And to me, that's like so obvious, right? That there's a scarcity problem, like that is what you see when there's a scarcity problem. That's what you see at the top of the market. And the real concern then becomes like, obviously, these people will be fine. People who are rich in scarcity, like they figure it out. They pay more money, they get what they want, they get what they need. Everyone else crowds more and more into smaller and smaller apartments, and we watch their neighborhood change, and they feel like the problem is that change happened. But the actual problem is that not enough change happened, that there was not either planning in advance to ensure that like when growth occurred, because New York City was not surprised by the growth it experienced. Like, like obviously there was a downturn in the 70s and people were really shocked and at that point excited to see people moving to New York City. But when that started happening, there was a concerted effort to maintain the physical infrastructure of the city as much as possible without realizing that the trade-off is then you lose the people. You have a real problem when you don't build enough for newcomers, and those newcomers are richer. They will take what they're able to get. And, I think many people feel like there has to be some way of like getting all the benefits of growth without accommodating all the new people who want to come in and be a part of that. But there's not. And we have to make sure that we're allowing for inclusive growth. And that's only going to happen by accepting that change is coming regardless. It's either the change you choose or the one that you hate. And that's it.
So if gentrification is just a sort of epiphenomenon of demand exceeding supply, does that mean that there's no real policy response to prevent it?
Well, I don't think it's just that. I think very clear. So gentrification is a term that comes out of London, the word gentry, of course, as you're watching kind of higher income yuppies move into these more middle class neighborhoods. There is clearly an aesthetic change that occurs when your community shifts in that way so that the balance of people changes what the previous group used to look like. So even in a world where I think you build enough in New York City, if a bunch of people move in and there used to be like a 20% Black population, but a bunch of people move in and they're all white, the proportion of Black people you see will go down. Like that's going to happen even if everyone who's there just stays regardless. And that comes with some serious costs, right? There's evidence that, for instance, you see higher number of calls for what's called quote unquote order maintenance policing. So maybe people calling because they're mad about noise complaints. Like during the pandemic, as lots of people were moving to Austin, there was an example of, I might be getting this wrong, but there was some sort of like racing sort of community event that would happen sometimes. A lot of the newcomers thought this was unsafe. They were upset about the noise. They thought people were drinking outside and like a violation of code. And they would call the cops and they would say, get rid of this. And that's not fake. Like that's people moving in and shifting the culture of a place that used to have a different culture. There's also, of course, just microaggressions that people will experience. Like if you have a community where you used to know all these people on your block, it becomes kind of a more posh or like nicer community. And then, you're the outsider all of a sudden in this place that you grew up in. Like that's not fake. Like that's sad. And that can make people feel bad. And that's not good. But what it is it's the result of the interaction of different cultures, and that is going to be messy no matter how it looks. And it's really concerning to me that our response to that is not how do we make sure that that can happen in a more conducive way, that we can remove at least the state violence that might come out of that part of it. And instead it's like, no, guys, like, let's keep these people segregated because then we'll have more calm in these communities. Because that's the opposite of gentrification in the American city. It's segregation. And in the neighborhoods that are stagnant, that don't have people moving in, what you see is still there's Matt Desmond research about this. There's Suleiman Osman talks about this in his great book, The Invention of Brownstone Brooklyn. But that you still see this almost the same rates of displacement happening in these communities that are not gentrifying of poor individuals, because when a place is dying, when it doesn't have people who want to move in, when it doesn't have that kind of economic vibrancy, you end up getting people who have to depopulate because the jobs don't exist, or the people who can get out leave. So like, maybe middle-class Black families will go to the suburbs rather than stay in these declining neighborhoods in center cities. And on the other hand, flip side of that is that you have these enclaves that have always been wealthy, or for decades have been wealthy, that have maintained sort of invisible color lines and class lines around them. And so we spend a lot of time talking about gentrification, which is happening in a very small number of American cities, because it's the place where you see that change, where you see that interaction of different cultures and classes, while we ignore what seems normal, which is segregation and stagnation, which is actually the name of the game in a lot of American neighborhoods. And to me, that's the real problem.
Bearing in mind that this is not the normal thing and gentrification is not seen everywhere, the big debate that I see around this issue, which is if I build a swanky new luxury condo in Brooklyn, what does that do to surrounding property values? Is it the case that like now there is more supply, and so people that, the rich people can move into the condos, and so that means that the people who aren't as rich get to stay in the existing housing stock at closer to existing levels? Or is it the case that everything just goes up in price?
There's not a simple answer to your question because it really depends how upzoning is done, what the effect will be. What I will say is broad-scale upzoning, I think the best evidence we have of this right now is what's happened in New Zealand, where there was a serious attempt across the whole country to change how planning and regulation was done. Is that kind of a supply shock across such a large market, you do see an amelioration in the rent appreciation. The best studies we have of in other contexts where you see much smaller changes, where you see, what is the effect of new rent on a building? There's a study about this in San Francisco. There's studies on this in Finland, in Boston, in New York City. And the consistent finding is that relative to the control, you see slower rent growth. That is obviously not like solving the housing crisis, but it's also really small.
But it helps at the margin.
Oh, yes, it helps at the margin. And I think that it is evidence of these are often very conservative estimates because the study design is very difficult to do. And so scholars are, concerned about how it's going to, about say overstating the benefits. But also these are in response to very small changes. So like what's the effect of just a few more buildings? And the fact that that's even measurable is insane.
Get 3% daily cash back when you use Apple Card to buy a new iPhone 15 or pair of AirPods at Apple. You can choose to grow it at 4.4% annual percentage yield when you open a savings account through Apple Card. Apply for Apple Card in the Wallet app on iPhone. Subject to credit approval. Savings is available to Apple Card owners subject to eligibility. Savings and Apple Card by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Member FDIC. Terms and more at applecard.com.
We are audiostack.ai.
Combining AI writing, the best synthetic voices,
with production and delivery.
Be it ads, podcasts, or VOs for video.
Just like this ad. How would you utilize AI audio? For free.
Go to audiostack.ai/contest.
Give us just a few details.
And you could replace this spot and be heard by millions.
See webpage for T's and C's. audiostack.ai/contest.
Hi, I'm Frances Fry.
And I'm Ann Morris.
And we are the hosts of a new TED podcast called Fixable.
We've helped leaders at some of the world's most competitive companies solve all kinds of problems.
On our show, we'll pull back the curtain and give you the type of honest, unfiltered advice we usually reserve for top executives.
Maybe you have a coworker with boundary issues, or you want to know how to inspire and motivate your team.
Give us a call, and we'll help you solve the problems you're stuck on.
Find Fixable wherever you listen.
Talking about New Zealand, this is one of my favorite natural experiments. New Zealand is a country of 3-4 million people, of which the large majority live in the North Island and the minority live in the South Island, mostly towards north of the South Island, near the North Island. Towards the south of the South Island, there's one medium-sized town called Christchurch. It's not close to anywhere, and it isn't a particularly pleasant town. It's, New Zealand.
You don't have a lot of New Zealand listeners?
New Zealand is one of my favorite places on the planet. It's one of the most beautiful countries in the world. But even the most diehard Kiwis will admit that Christchurch is not New Zealand at its best.
I would love to come to New Zealand. If anyone's listening who wants to bring me to
New Zealand is amazing. Everyone should go to New Zealand. But what happened is that there was an earthquake in Christchurch, and a bunch of housing was rendered uninhabitable as a result of the earthquake. Not a lot, like we're talking a few dozen houses, maybe a couple hundred. That earthquake in Christchurch caused a significant measurable spike in home values in Auckland, way at the other end of the country. There was just nowhere for those people to go, and suddenly everyone needed to find somewhere, and there was nowhere to go, and prices just started spiraling upwards in hundreds of miles away on a completely different island. That is you're right, that these things can have astonishing effects, and that was part of what caused the Kiwi government to say, rising house prices are a real problem, we need to do something about it. One of the fascinating things about the politics of house prices is that even when everyone agrees that house prices are too high, there's never a constituency for them to come down. Because, as we discovered in 2008, when house prices go down, all fucking hell breaks loose. So the Kiwi government had to manage this quite carefully. They had to make sure that house prices stopped going up, but that they didn't start going down. And so eventually they would kind of just inflate their way into a state of affordability. And I think that's something that we can think about right now at the present moment in the United States, because I think I've lived in the US for 27 years, and I've never seen a political moment where there's broad agreement on the left and right that house prices are too high. And in a country with 65% home ownership, normally there's no such thing as too high. You know, if we all own our homes, and in terms of people who vote, it's much more than 65% of voters own their homes. If you want to be attractive to voters, you want them, they want them to be happy, and the idea that there's such a thing as your house is too expensive is unthinkable. But what happened recently? What happened in the past couple of years that even the homeowners who are presumptively benefiting from this raise in house prices have now agreed, whether they're Republicans and whether they're Democrats, that house prices are too high and that something must be done?
It's actually, first I'll give you an anecdote. There was, I think it was early 2021, and the Biden administration, sometime during the Biden administration, they sent out a press release which was just talking about the strength of the economy, and they were just like, inflation is such a problem, but at the same time, at least home values are strong. it was just so absurd. I remember tweeting it out, and someone at the Biden administration was like, "That's not what we meant," and it's like, no, it is what you meant. It's what everybody means, and it's, you know, this really interesting paradox of everyone's kind of concerned about housing affordability, but also strong markets are great. And there was like a recent, I think, Wall Street Journal article that was headlined something about, you know, is the market in Austin, like, rents are coming down. It's like such a problem. The market's so weak after there's been a concerted effort to try to bring down rents in Austin. So it is a serious paradoxical problem, because the way we talk about markets is often kind of in serious contest with many of the goals that policymakers might have about housing. Yeah, I don't think that that's been resolved. I think that's just the tension. Homeownership is the way that we build wealth in the United States, or at least upper middle class families are able to build wealth in the United States, and people have learned to expect a certain level of appreciation, particularly in certain places. If you buy a house in San Francisco, if you make that bet in like in a superstar city in America, you don't just expect to like get your money back. You expect to make a serious return on that, and that expectation can be very concerning for policymakers. But I don't think that's really broken. I think it's just what's happened is that housing affordability got really bad during the pandemic, and it got really bad really fast in a lot of places that thought that there was a coastal problem. I talked to policymakers in like Montana or Utah who were just like, you know, we thought this was just like Californians being stupid. We kind of thought this was like this is a New York issue and not really for us. And the pandemic happens, and it's kind of like similar to what you said about New Zealand, but, you know, we experienced it here. It did not take that many people moving to town in Montana that has great skiing, or to Utah or
Boise.
Yes, Boise.
Boise famously had like 85% home price appreciation in the space of a year and a half or something.
Yeah, it was insane. It's one of the fastest growing housing markets even now in the US. And Nashville or Charlotte, these places, like, you know, you had this kind of reaction to newcomers as if there were like millions of people suddenly flooding in. It didn't take that many people to come to actually kind of spike prices, of course, because it's just there's only a fraction of homes in a given market that are ever on sale. So you don't need every home to be, anyway, so that doesn't take that many people to actually create this problem. And so policymakers were kind of just shocked by it. And a couple of things happened. One is that their fear made them turn to try to get solutions quickly. And the second is because the kind of run-up was relatively new, you didn't have a highly developed anti-growth coalition in all of these places. So Montana, they're not used to having like a bunch of NIMBY fights in most of Montana. That's not like a thing that happens like it happens in San Francisco or New York, where you've had significant development pressure for a long time. So you've developed a serious political coalition of neighborhood groups or lawyers or environmental organizations that have become real experts and parts of the system in slowing down housing production and in slowing down, the whole process in particular. So because of that, policymakers were able to act relatively quickly, more so in Republican states where they have fewer concerns about the potential localized costs of development. So in like a Montana, you saw significant amounts of achievement, but also a lot of these other states on the coast, because they've been fighting it for so long and the run up in prices also affected their suburbs. So, in California, the highest increase in rents was in like kind of the exurbs and suburbs and cities like Sacramento, where of course these were not cheap cities or cheap areas by any means, but they were much more affordable. And so now even kind of like the buffers are now being, run up. And so you have this kind of like shock to the system. So Washington State, I think, is like kind of an unsung hero in how much legislation they've passed. And I really just think at some level here, what's happened is not that the homeowner desire to maintain high property values has gone away, because in the grand scheme of things, many of these changes are, pretty small. But that people are recognizing that there's also another politically potent class of people who is concerned about this, which is, higher income young people who want to buy homes, who are in their 30s. Millennials were entering into their prime home buying years during the pandemic. It's a massive generation of people who are significant voting bloc. They're not just like kids anymore. And so now you're having to see what this fight's going to look like. And it's not really clear how the politics of this shakes out in the future.
One of the big theses of my book is that the pandemic effectively caused a huge amount of commercial real estate to migrate into residences, and that a massive millions and millions of white-collar workers especially entered this hybrid workforce, which means they're working from home at least some of the time. And when you're working from home and you're on Zoom calls and you're talking to your colleagues, you really want privacy. You want a room where you can close the door and that has a window. And in real
podcast
estate,
studio.
In real estate terms, a room where you can close the door and it has a window, it has a name. It's called a bedroom. And so what people discovered was that they actually wanted one more bedroom than they had. Or if for some couples, like two more bedrooms than they had. And so without any new household formation, demand for bedrooms and demand for extra space started going through the roof. You didn't really need anyone moving from New York to Boise to cause that spike in demand in Boise. You just needed people in Boise saying, I want an extra bedroom to be able to work from home.
Yeah, no, I mean, so Nicholas Bloom is a Stanford professor, and he's been writing about remote work since even before the pandemic, and he has something he's called the donut effect, which just talks about where home prices rose, and it's sort of like a donut when you overlay it on a city. So like the center city saw even decreases in rents, whereas the suburbs and exurbs saw increases in rents. And I mean, most people don't realize this, but like most moves are local. I mean, 80-something% of moves happen within a state. I think like 70-something, don't quote me on this live podcast where I'm a journalist, but 70-something happen within even a county moves. And so, you have a situation here where you're right, like, people just had this shock for one more bedroom, and then often, which is interesting, I think that the people get into homes often, they decide, oh, well, we could have a kid, right? And so it goes in that direction too, where you saw kind of like a mini baby boom as well happen in the pandemic, I think, partly as a result of people getting into home ownership for the first time. And of course, it coincided with very, very low rates. So that also is a part of the story. But yeah, it doesn't take a bunch of Californians moving to your town to screw up your housing market.
One thing that happened in the early years of the pandemic was that home ownership rate among millennials went over 50%. And this was, again, for someone who's been part of the housing discourse for many years, like this was always the thing. The millennials were this generation that would never own their own homes, and the home ownership was always out of reach. And then suddenly, without really anyone noticing it, like most millennials now own their own homes, which is a massive change, and I don't think has really been fully appreciated. And now the people who can't afford this, it's not actually the millennials anymore, it's the Zoomers.
The pandemic really spurred this on. Of course, millennials hadn't really entered into their prime home buying years until 5 or 6 years ago. So a lot of those stories, I think, were very premature. But there was the real thing that happened with millennials is that the Great Recession really delayed and impacted their finances. Like, they were behind as a cohort other generations for a while. So these stories weren't coming out of nowhere, but it is remarkable that still, the majority of Americans are homeowners. I mean, over 60% of Americans are homeowners. And so it becomes, kind of hard to deal with the political realities of that when you're trying to respond to a housing crisis. But at the same time, we have to remember it's like really, really different experiences, different homeowners, right? Like when we're talking about a homeowner who lives in the Bay Area, that's very different than someone who maybe has like, they bought like $170,000 house in like a suburb of like Cleveland or something. Like it's just like not the exact same thing. I also think that it's really interesting to think about what happens when a lot of boomers no longer have their home anymore because they've passed, and what happens to that great wealth transfer. I think Tal Smith in the New York Times has an interesting story about wealth transfer, but I mean, I think that real estate transfer is going to do something really interesting to politics, because is it the case that, all of these boomers just pass it to their millennial children who live in big cities? Now those people are no longer a block pushing for housing affordability. Do people even want to live where their parents live in the suburbs? Do they sell that? Is it easier to do YIMBY politics when the boomer class is no longer with us? Like, I don't know. It's a weird thought.
Jerusalem Demsas,
I'm not rooting for this.
Yeah, I'm just saying you're one of the people doing the Gen X erasure. I will say.
Oh, yeah.
But,
I don't even know what that is.
Everyone talks about, the boomers, they hand things on to their millennial kids. Wait, there's a generation in the middle there.
I've never
It has 5 people in it. Yeah. On which note, I think we wrap it up. Thank you all for coming out and sitting through this podcast taping. Thank you, Jerusalem, for dropping just an absolutely insane amount of knowledge on us. This has been spectacular. Thank you to everyone here at the Hewlett Foundation for all of your audio-visual amazingness. Thanks to Jared Downing and Cheyna Roth, the producers of Slate Money. I'll be back on Saturday with another Slate Money.
Thanks for having me.
When it comes to your finances, go for the credit card that's always there for you. With 24/7 US-based live customer service from Discover, everyone has the option to talk to a real person anytime, day or night. Yep, that means no more waiting for, quote, normal business hours just to get a hold of someone. We're talking real service from real people whenever you need it. Get the customer service you deserve with Discover. Limitations apply. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
We are audiostack.ai.
Combining AI writing, the best synthetic voices,
with production and delivery.
Be it ads, podcasts, or VOs for video.
Just like this ad. How would you utilize AI audio? For free.
Go to audiostack.ai/contest.
Give us just a few details.
And you could replace this spot and be heard by millions.
See webpage for T's and C's. audiostack.ai/contest.